the memoir process was as rich a process as the initial journey that I took. And that, in fact, I didn't quite understand everything, all the nuances of what I had experienced until I started thinking about it in this more formal way. The idea there was to try to encourage people, just because it doesn't work the first time or the second time or the third time or the fourth
Mhm.
time, as long as you're still enthusiastic about it. I had just recently read Stephen King's On Writing, and I
Mhm.
realized there was a way to mold a book into being, a hybrid memoir.
For Love of Memoir is a place for people who have a passion for human stories. The ones we tell, the ones we carry, and the ones we're still trying to understand. Here, we talk with writers about their life-changing experiences and what it takes to bring those stories onto the page and into the world. Whether you simply love a good story or aspire to write your own, you're in the right place. Hi, Matthew.
Hi there, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
We are here today to talk about your very unique work, A Memory Mosaic, which is the first sort of memoir that also teaches people how to write a memoir. I found it so unique. So I'm really, really excited to air this episode. For those who are watching that are not necessarily familiar with your work, why don't you
Mhm.
just kind of give us a brief summary of what it's about, other than helping writers create a
Right.
memoir?
Um, the sort of foundation layer, the anchor to the book, is a story about an episode in my life, a trek that I took with a friend of mine, Chris, in Nepal, up into uh, we met in Kathmandu, Nepal, and then we went up to just north of there and did a trek 5 days up and 5 days back to the Langtang Valley, which sort of has a Shangri-La ring to it. Um, and so that was the core of it. It's been something that's been a story that's been floating around in my writing life almost since the time that I went on the trip. The trip itself was in 1980, and a lot of what the book is about is just giving people a feel of what travel was like in 1980, because there's a lot about it that's surprisingly different than what it's like now.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, for sure.
so the as I said, the anchor to the book is the trek. It's,
Mhm.
as far as that part of it is concerned, it's very linear, it's very chronological. I
Mhm.
have day one through day 10. It's based those 10 days, and what happens in each of those sections of the book is the sort of kernel of it that I started with, is that I had a book. This is the book still that I had, where I wrote in it. I had a diary of my entire trip. And also, what turned out to be an unusual sidelight to this diary is that I had essentially a traveling guest book. So everybody who I met and talked with long enough to feel that I could dare to ask them if they would sign my book, signed the book. And there are about 70 people who signed it, about 50 different entries, since there were a
What a
couple
great
contiguous.
idea.
Um, that was a great idea. I had other things I realized 30 years later I should have done as well. But so the 10 days of the trek
Mhm.
are there as that solid foundation. But I know you're interested in getting into the idea of writing a linear chronological memoir as opposed to a nonlinear one. And
Mhm.
so what I've done here is actually combining the two at the same time. In 2015,
Mhm.
there was a major earthquake. The largest, most deadly earthquake in Nepal in their history. Um, and, it obviously had its effect. It shook some things up in my mind, though what's interesting is it took me 4 years. Often you can have something that is, a huge influence and something that's is a spark to your imagination, and yet it doesn't necessarily start getting expressed in words for years. And so what I ended up writing is mostly there now in the book of, what happened when the earthquake hit 3, 4 years before that.
Help bridge the gap for me because you
Yeah.
started as a novel and you said that just wasn't working. So, at what point did you decide that you wanted to do this work as a memoir?
Well, I think, you know, I decided in 2021, I was in a memoir writers group on Facebook. I don't, as I remember it, I had not even made the decision that it was going to be a memoir when I started doing that. I said, I am going to write a story using this material. Very early on, this was the first, just a few months after I moved into the house that I'm currently in, there's this crazy huge tree sitting in my backyard. You can't miss it just looking out the back window every morning, anytime I sat down at the kitchen table. And I started realizing there's the idea that there's the trunk, which is the main story, and there's the roots of what feeds that trunk and nourishes it of all the experiences that you had in life. And then there are the branches that come off from the
Mm,
trunk that are all the experiences and thoughts and lessons that you learn as a result or after having had that core experience. And that was my guiding metaphor for a long time. Um, and in fact, that's eventually how I ended up coming up with the mosaic idea, which is sort of to say, don't let yourself get too trapped in having to follow a writing formula too much. Just
it
do the
can
writing
paralyze
and
you.
let it.
Yeah, like trying to figure out um a straight through line for a story or how to force in an arc can actually like it I've found myself with analysis paralysis a lot while
Right.
working
Mhm.
on my own because you just get kind of too bogged down into it. I agree. I think sometimes the point is just to write. Just
Mhm.
write and it will all come together the way that it's supposed to when it hits you. Like it'll come to you
Right.
what you want to do
And also,
eventually.
I mean, one of the things is even if what you end up with in the very end is a very chronologically based narrative,
Hmm.
you can do that by taking the pieces together and setting them up in chronological
That's right.
order
Yep.
and sprinkling in with them, you know, flashbacks and recollections
Exactly.
as the things that fed into that narrative and reflections on and lessons learned. You can, sprinkle those in as well, and that can be one solid narrative. What I did with my book was, as I got done with the 3, 4 months of just writing small pieces and got myself up to a point where I felt not necessarily that I'd said everything that I might say, but felt like I had enough of a full package of materials to work with that I started to piece them together. But what I
Hmm.
did was I decided that I wasn't going to force it together into one narrative. That was something that I started seeing as I was looking at all those little pieces. How did were those little pieces going to work? At first, I thought, well, I'll wedge this into here during day one and this into day. And eventually I decided, no, I'll just do the straight narrative of the trek first.
Hmm.
And then the things that sort of got raised either directly or obliquely by what was in that particular day's narrative in small sections that followed it. And as I was doing that, I started realizing I was in these groups on Facebook, and people would be asking questions and talking about it. And I was realizing that I was getting answers to some of their questions about who the audience should be, um, how do you deal with chronology? I mean, I can just look again at my, who are some of the sections of the Creating Your Memoir, what is a memoir and why do you write? Uh, who are you writing for? Assembling information. And I
Mhm.
realized I could give people some good advice on that. And once I started doing that, I had written those things and I started thinking I should include that in addition as well, because I had just recently read Stephen King's On Writing, and I
Mhm.
realized there was a way to mold a book into being, a hybrid memoir as well as I don't like to call it how to, it's more why to.
Yeah.
There's only one or two of those dozen sections that I have on creating your memoir that are really talking about the brass tacks
Mhm.
of memoir writing. There's
Sure.
some about research, but there's a lot about, as I said, audience and things like, how do you get your inspiration? Towards the end, I talk about, it's a section called If at First You Don't Succeed, and it talks about the essentially 15 years it took from the time I thought that I would like to write a book on the trek in 2009 to
Right.
having a memory mosaic as a
Right.
completed book. And the idea there was to try to encourage people, just because it doesn't work the first time or the second time or the third time or the fourth
Mhm.
time, as long as you're still enthusiastic about it, find out new ways to try to do it until it works for
Yeah, and let it unfold however it's going to unfold. I mean, I've talked to
you.
authors who have written their book from idea to publishing and print within a year.
Mhm.
And then I've talked to other authors where it's taken them 20 or 25 years. So I think it
Right.
just kind of depends on the reason why you're doing it, first and
Mhm.
foremost. And exactly what it is. You know what I mean? You kind of have to be happy with what it is you want to convey, right?
Right.
And for people who tend to be a bit more artistic, I think it takes us a lot longer because we want to embed more than just telling a story,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So, okay, so take us back to 2015 when you
Mhm.
learned of the earthquake in the Langtang Valley.
Okay.
Why don't you read us that
Okay.
piece?
Let
Would
me
love to
read
hear
this
it.
for you. It's Saturday, April 25th, 2015, 11:56 and 26 seconds a.m. Nepal Standard Time. In the Himalayan foothills, 50 miles northwest of the capital city of Kathmandu, a displacement in the Earth's ever-shifting plates 5 miles underground wells up to the surface and across the nation. At home in Chicago, it's 1:11 a.m. on a quiet weekend. After 56 seconds, that terrifying tremor subsides, and I sleep, undisturbed and unaware. I don't know that sacred beloved temples in the capital toppled, nor do I know that 100 miles farther east on Mount Everest, 22 have perished, the mountain's deadliest day. My morning arrives, and I turn on the radio to a story told worldwide. 9,000 people have died, making it the deadliest earthquake in Nepal's history. The news hits me harder than many. I climbed the steps of those Buddhist temples in the days just before I set forth on a trekking adventure up to the Langtang Valley. Now, those steps and those temples that took many years to erect have collapsed in moments to piles of unrecognizable rubble. I walked the crowded streets, thinking how unsteady the buildings to each side of me appeared, how a tiny tremor could topple them. But I had no serious thought that such a thing might really happen. Travelers in a foreign land don't entertain such thoughts. I was part of a tribe of impervious observers of the faraway and exotic, as I'd been many times before in my young life. Now it's 9 days later, and a follow-up report pops up on the evening news. My valley, 12,500 feet up in those foothills, so close to the epicenter, was also crushed. Several whole villages were obliterated. In the village of Langtang, where I walked and even slept a night, more than 300 residents had been buried, as likely had been dozens of foreign trekkers.
Oof. Thanks for reading that.
Sure.
You talk about in your memoir sections
Mhm.
about how memoir needs to start with a spark. So how did you know that was going to be your spark?
I mean, when it comes down to it, the only significant newsworthy event that occurs in the entire book is this earthquake. Everything else is this inconsequential stuff about some guy who goes off on the trip and, like so many other people, has gone up into the foothills with a bunch of Sherpa porters to have a interesting time and something interesting to talk to people about for years to come. So I realized I wanted to start it off with the fact that anchored to everything else, this story took place in this location where these horrifying things, this devastating um, earthquake had occurred. What I get into later also is, and this has to do with, as I said, one of the layers I put on to the telling of the book is talking about time in its many different ways. I'm a person who's way too wedded to the minutes and seconds of life and knowing what the time is and how long things are taking. I very specifically, that was one reason why I very specifically here wrote to start off this section
The time.
was 11:56 and 26 seconds, Nepal Standard Time. And, you know, and there was 56 seconds long. And all of this happened, this most devastating thing. And at the same time, and I pick up on this later on, the first of all, that earthquakes as being part of the sort of more geological history of the world that works on a much different time frame. And I talk about it towards the end of the book about I have a number of things I call snippets on time, and one of them is a snippet about deep time and talking about how you know these huge that the earth is engaged in these huge events and all the people scurrying about on the surface of the earth are inconsequential compared with the millions and even billions of years that pass and the literal tectonic changes that happen
Yeah.
in the world. But I also sneaked in the fact and talk about time as in time zones later on. The crazy fact that if you read that section carefully, you realize that this happens at 46 minutes after the hour or 56 minutes after the hour in Nepal, but I'm sleeping at 11 minutes after the hour in Chicago. And how is it possible that I didn't make some grave editing mistake? And the answer is the weirdness of time zones and the strange things that are the case of time zones in India and especially in Nepal. And so, I played with that a lot and tried. I put in little tiny hints early on and then just let them slide for a good long while and then pick them up, 100 pages later.
This might be a good opportunity to talk about why
Mhm.
you chose the name A Memory Mosaic. And it might be a good time to show the cover because
Right.
I think we're kind of touching on all of these different
Yep.
pieces here.
Mhm. So
Yeah,
here's the cover.
beautiful, by the way.
Thank you. Um, I did conceive the cover. I did not execute the cover, however. And part of the story of making the memoir does have to do with the creation of the cover, the idea that came to mind of what I wanted to have on the cover, and that in itself was an editing process, essentially an evolution. Um, I wrote a post in one of the Facebook uh, groups about how I had developed the idea of the cover, starting, and with my first inspiration, I showed 6 panels, 6 different pictures. And the first picture was the picture of that tree I talked about outside in my backyard, and how I then decided I wanted to have a, an artistic rendition of a tree. And then at that point, I came across this mosaic artist who happened to live, just Googling tree illustrations, um, who lives in Nova Scotia, named Catherine Vanderwoord. And so I found this tree mosaic that she did, and that prompted me to think, I like this. It has my tree metaphor, and I was starting to think of the metaphor of the little pieces that you put together that each might seem almost impossible to make sense of, but when you put them all together, they form one picture. And so that was the point at which I came up with the title. I didn't have the title until I saw her mosaic work with the tree that I love so much. And so I created this thing that said a memory mosaic sort of over the tree, and showed it to people in the Facebook group. And they said, "Isn't this a story about Nepal? What does a tree have to do with Nepal?" And I realized that I was inspiring myself. And it was an important step to take in the writing process and the inspiration process. But this wasn't the right thing to have on the cover of my book. And so this is an early version of what the cover was, where this is actually based on 3 different um, photos that I just pulled off of, Google Images, and pasted them together in Photoshop. And that served, first of all, as my inspiration for about a year, so that I had a conception of what my cover was. But it was also at that point, I was able to show that cover design, that layout, to Kathy, the mosaic artist, and ask her, could you do this? What's, talking reasonable size so it doesn't break my bank? How big would you have to make it in order to make this work? She said, oh, I think I could do it in about 16 by 24 inches. I guess what we can do is,
Yeah.
what she, and then she asked me, I asked her, thinking, oh God, this is going to take me 8 months to get this thing at this point. I said, well, how long will it take? And she said, it's going to take a while, 4 or 5 weeks. So this is what she ended up creating. Now,
Absolutely stunning.
it's absolutely stunning. It's incredible in a window, with sunlight coming through it. Beautiful glass textures. I, in fact, tried to just take it and put that onto the cover, and it did not work at all because it was so complex. The texturing was so complex that all the type elements got totally overwhelmed, and
I
you can imagine.
imagine.
And so it turned out she had also taken a picture of it on a light table that washed out a lot of the sense of the glass. If you look really carefully at the cover, there are a few places where you can see little imperfections that indicate that's actually glass.
Yeah.
But that worked, especially as I started massaging how to work with color, what things to make a little darker, a little lighter, that sort of things. But I suddenly was totally immersed in this idea of the mosaic as a uh, a metaphor for writing any book. I mean, I think in fiction, probably more people will tend to write in a more flow through sort of way.
Mhm.
With memoir, especially, I think it really works very well to think in those terms of trying to use your memory wherever those memories pop up, take advantage of them, write them down, whether it's 3 or 4 sentences or 3 or 4 pages, to get something down
Yeah.
and eventually figure out how to put all of it together.
Well, I think too, in creative nonfiction, to your point, as long as you make it a point to write those things down, even if it is a few words, it may not make it into the greater work. It may
Oh,
not
right.
make it into
Hmm.
your book, but there's something that you will glean from it, or something
Hmm.
that it will spark another memory
Right.
that will pull something together for you. Just
Hmm.
right. That's the point. Just right.
Hmm.
You talk about the importance of allowing memories to just surface naturally.
Hmm.
Can you walk us through maybe a memory from your trek that led to another one and to another one,
Ah, well, that's a good question.
rather than forcing the structure, I
Right.
think is what the words say.
Well, one of the things that I was tracking the whole time during the trek was the sort of evolution of the restaurants that I went to. And it wasn't until a fair bit of time, I mean, during the trip, I was recognizing some of this, and it sort of coalesced a lot more in the years to come, and especially when I started thinking about what happened when the the guide that we had, Tashi, and I, at the end of the 10 days of the trek, we had a couple of extra hours, and he brought me to a restaurant in the trading town where the trek started and the buses ended. Um, and that's where I was much more reminded of meeting a fellow traveler, much like me. He was obviously American, and how much this was somebody who did not make it into my roving guest book. He was just one of the most annoying people I ever met in my life, who all he could do was complain about everything. And
How
it,
very American.
I know, I mean, that was part of it too. I was so glad. First of all, I was coming down from the end of the trek, so I had experienced much rougher conditions. Every, couple of days, you were moving into a new sort of stratum of economies. And so the restaurants were getting simpler and the food was getting simpler and it cost half as much as it did 2 days before. And I was coming back to, on the 10th day of the trip, to this restaurant that felt to me to be really pretty nice. And all he could do was complain about everything. And it wasn't really until I was writing about the book whether I started thinking, is this really his personality? Was he having a really awful day? Was he?
Is he gonna make it if he's just out
Oh yeah, I
starting
mean,
out
if
his
he was on the
journey?
start of his trek, oh my God, this wasn't going to be a good time. Um, but there were just things like that that I, especially I guess like the landslide and not thinking about the fact of what that small landslide we encountered really meant. I just thought it was, you know, something inconsequential, but really it probably was just one of these small indications that the earth was shimmying a bit and trying to stay stable, but that in another 35 years everything was going to break loose.
Yeah.
So,
It's really amazing how I hate to use the word insignificant, but I think that's the only word for it. We really are when you really think about it in that context, right?
right. I mean, that's part of it. Um, one of the things, one of the things I do explore in the book is sort of all the different perspectives of storytelling. Here's this one story. My friend Chris and I go on this trek. We and come back, and then I go for a few more days on my own on a separate little adventure, and that's the extent of it. What I wanted to do was talk about the fact that there isn't one way to get your story across.
Mhm.
Um, that I talk about the fact, you can pick your medium. Maybe you aren't a really a writer, you're an artist. So do it in pictures, do it if you're
Yep.
if you're good at sort of graphic novel type art, do that
Yep.
and add a little bit of narrative along with it, express it visually like that. If you were a really good photographer and have huge documentation of a particular episode in your life, do it mainly through the photographs with some
Yeah.
illuminating captions to go along with it. You don't have to simply, write a memoir that you people will say that's reasonable, you can get this published. You know, you can write a straight memoir that is you recalling as best and as honestly as your memory can provide uh, to tell that story.
Hmm.
But a lot of books that have been published that are really close to being a memoir were presented as fiction, you
Hmm.
know, lightly fictionalized. And
Yep.
I mentioned the fact that probably one that's considered one of the first major ones was David Copperfield by Charles Dickens.
Yeah.
That most of it was really his own life. He just shifted names and embellished the way he was so able to do, but
Hmm.
that basically it was autobiographical fiction.
Fiction.
There's
Also
a
referred to as
book,
autofiction. Yeah.
right, autofiction. A lot of people think I can only write a memoir if I'm writing about the horrible traumas that happened in my early life. When you especially participate in a lot of the Facebook groups, there's a lot of focus on the healing the trauma by writing the memoir. And I think that's an aspect of it. It's gaining, but it's part of a larger framework of what it's like to write a memoir. And that's part of what the sub level that I get to of of writing a memoir about writing a memoir,
Hmm.
that that is the journey as much as for me, the, I'm writing about a journey, taking this trek up to Nepal,
Hmm.
up to Langtang and back. But and in fact, that's why fairly early on, maybe it's actually in the back cover. I guess it's somewhere else where I talk about the fact this that the trek was a once in a lifetime adventure, but that the writing of the memoir was, an adventure of a lifetime.
Mm.
And the the memoir process was as rich a process as the initial journey that I took. And that in fact, I didn't quite understand everything, all the nuances of what I had experienced until I started thinking about it in this more formal way. There's a quote that I have in the book several times of, I wrote her name. I always forget her name. Kate DiCamillo. She wrote Because of Winn-Dixie.
Hmm.
Um, but in an interview she did on a podcast a few years ago, she was talking about the process of writing realistic fiction, but you know, getting things across in that way. And her point, what she said in very terse, you know, pithy terms, she said, life is chaos, art is pattern. That our lives in a certain sense don't make sense.
Yep.
They're chaos. They're many random things that doesn't necessarily on its surface all fit together. But if you start examining it and seeing the patterns, seeing the sort of motifs in your life, the themes that seem to be recurring, even though you really didn't notice that you were doing things that way, you start, what you're doing is you're making art out of your life.
Yeah. And learning a whole
Transformed it
lot
into
about
meaning
yourself in the
and learning,
process.
right. And that's as valuable as the process.
Absolutely. I couldn't
Mhm.
agree with that more. What did you learn about yourself on the whole journey of the actual
Um,
journey and the journey of writing about it?
what I realized was for 40 years while I was telling people about the trek, I was always talking about Tashi as being very disappointing. He barely spoke English. He didn't, when he spoke English, it was so cryptic that it was like some mystic oracle was talking, not an actual human being. And what I started to gather from examining what this whole trek was like and what we'd experienced, you know, what I say and what Tashi knew, until I was far into writing this book, bathing myself in the memories of the trek, I was always disappointed. I was always disappointed in Tashi for his minimal English and inability to be a tour guide. He would he wasn't, pointing out the sights and things like that. No longer. What did Tashi know? That I was a stranger in his world, that I was a neophyte, that I was curious and open and willing to learn, but cautious, that eventually, like a small child learning his environment, let loose to explore and be independent within bounds, like that 6-year-old child allowed to roam the Danish world. I would be kept safe within limits, Tashi keeping a tether from afar to let his charge be freer. And I realized this guy was, in retrospect, this guy was amazing. And on top of that, I was this goofball who was going on this trip. Granted, it served them well. It served them as work to do to be porters and guides for Westerners who came in. But he knew his world. He was treating me very differently on day 9 than he was on day 2.
Mm.
you know, and I was really excited to realize that that was the case by that time.
You talk about in one of your reflection sections about selecting memories that serve the emotional truth of your memoir.
Mhm.
Were there any, I'm interested to know, that you had to leave out for that reason? And if so, why?
It's funny doing this. There wasn't very much that I decided not to include once I wrote it. Um, in a way, I was sort of surprised by that. Going into it, I thought I would write a couple 100,000 words and find the best 70,000 of them.
Mm-hmm.
As it was, I pretty much most of the rewriting work was tightening up what I had and maybe expanding some, just elaborating on certain places where I realized things weren't clear enough. There were very few things I can even think of that I wrote and decided that I wouldn't include. There is one section which a lot of people, a number of people who have read it wondered why I included it. It's a thing, one of my sort of base memories having to do with one of the earliest ones is when I was a child, coming back from the year we lived in Denmark, and I was 7 years old at the time. And what happened was I went to sleep one night a few days after we came back in the same bed, in the same place, in the same room that I had been sleeping in the days before we left for Denmark. And in the middle of the night, I woke up and I wasn't sure. I realized that when I woke up, that I had dreamt my entire year in Denmark, in Europe. And when I started realizing that, I woke up. In other words, I had a dream in which I fell asleep one night in that bed and dreamt my entire night, my entire year in Denmark. And until I was able to get up and figure things out, I did not know whether we were still about to go on our trip or whether I really had gone on the trip.
Wow.
And that was important to me to keep in. I had a further dream when I was 18 years old in the dentist's office, and I had my other weird dream experience where my dentist used laughing gas. He gave me more than he probably should have. I went completely under, and I had a dream that the world really didn't exist and that I was this being who was captured for eternity, sort of stuck in this, I don't know, not even prison, just stuck in a chair, being tormented forever until finally the dentist woke me up. And I felt I that's one where a lot of people don't understand why I put it in. I felt like I wanted to expand on this idea of dreams and the immensity of space and the insignificance of life. And I always wonder if I were ever to get this book published by a traditional publisher, would the editor say, "No way, this is a
Take it
waste of
out.
time. We got to take it out."
Yeah.
Having self-published the book, I felt I'm sticking with this one.
Yeah.
It may not
Well,
make sense. It may not make sense to everybody, but it's less than a page long. They can get by it and get back. And some people will figure out why why it fits in to my psychology and my
right.
understanding and my thoughts about, yeah, time and space and, big things like the universe and tiny things like people on this planet. So,
And it really fits in pretty well with the mosaic motif, I think.
mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, it is that theme of of dreams and how dreams fit in, and the idea of dreams within dreams, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And so,
That's wild. And what a horrible, horrible experience at the dentist. You said in one of your craft sections that
mhm,
the memoir ends when the writer finally recognizes the through line.
right.
What was the moment you realized that the story was done, that your story was done?
I think what really convinced me that I had the whole thing done was when I realized that what I'm going to do is a sort of a capstone to the project, putting the earthquake right at the beginning like that, and this recollection as well early on the trek of the landslide that we encountered. That
Mm.
that those gave a context, a larger context of where I felt my little trip fit in.
And you put a bow on it. I
Yeah,
love
put a
it.
bow on it. Yeah.
How's it been received by readers?
Um, I've it's remained fairly limited as far as circulation. Mostly, I've been giving it to people in the Facebook groups I've been in because they're the target audience as much
Mhm.
as any other audience. Um, people who are writing their memoirs or thinking about writing it, and so I've early on I was giving it, offering to give it out to those people primarily just to find out, just to help them along and maybe find out how they were doing. And more recently, I realized that I sort of have been framing this process wrong, that it really is much more of a two-way street to be sharing this with the, community of memoir writers
Mhm.
and even would-be memoir writers and learning, you know, getting their impressions, their thoughts about how well it worked for them. Most of the feedback that I've gotten from it has been extremely good. Um, a lot of people in some ways were fairly surprised. Um, one of the very first readers that I had was Kathy, the mosaic artist.
Yeah.
And, she admitted to me that she never read books. She didn't have the attention span to read through books. Um, but I had sent her a PDF of the entire book and pointed out to her just a page or two where she was mentioned and how the mosaic cover came into being and the mosaic concept and everything. And she then told me that she wanted to say that she had read the whole thing. And although she knew she was never going to write a memoir, she doesn't like writing. She found herself repeatedly just stopping in the middle of something that I was writing and thinking about her own life and thinking about how this memory or that memory was fitting in somewhere that she had never thought about before.
That's what
And
it's
that
all
was one of the
about.
most rewarding
Yep.
feedback that I ever got, that it could have that effect on somebody who had
Doesn't normally even read.
but wouldn't even normally read. Yeah.
Right. What do you hope people will take away when they read it?
Um, well, I mean, I hope they take away that it's an entertaining story because there are some weird wrinkles to it, especially, I mean, just who Chris happens to be turns
Mhm.
out to be sort of unexpected. Um, and I, I I'd like people to take from it just this glimpse into a world that is very different now than it was back then. You know, when I came home actually from the trip 2 days early because I had gotten a nasty fungal infection on my hand at the end of the trek, and I um had told my parents they were going to meet me at Kennedy Airport in New York to meet a particular flight on, I think it was the 18th of April. And I was arriving on the 16th of April because I left 2 days early. And they had no idea because
There were no cell phones.
there
It's
were
not like
no,
you could shoot them a text.
I could have, well, what it was is my only recourse was when I got to London, I went to the international phone booths that they had set up.
Yeah.
Through an operator, you got connected, and I called up my parents and said, I'm arriving in 8 hours. I'll be there. When they were expecting me to be there 2 days later.
Later.
Um, so that sort of thing. So much has changed that it's in funny ways when you do a memoir like this, you're creating a sort of historical record of what it's like in 1980. I'm also, since I go back and talk about that year in Denmark in 1962 and 63, I'm talking about what it's like to have been, in post-war
Yeah.
Denmark,
Yeah.
16 years, 17 years after World War II ended. It was a
Yeah.
very different sort of place. And that's with a lot of memoir. It can be interesting, based on an interesting core, sort of anchoring event in your life, and then doing something like what I did of spinning off memories sprinkled all around your life before and
Yeah.
after that point. And you produce, a rich document of what life was like.
I think I often wonder if 4 generations down the line, if our great, 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 great grandchildren or whatever were to read our memoir, how much of themselves they would see in
Mhm.
those stories and in the personality that comes out in those stories. It's so
Right.
important.
Plus, in addition to that, they might be looking at it, and the story they reads as foreign as us reading,
Maybe.
something written by some colonial ancestor in 1770
Right,
or something.
right. Yeah. So
And
where's the best?
all of that's just a blip, remember.
It's true.
Yeah.
We are all just a blip. Everything is just a
Mhm.
blip when you really. Have you ever seen that photograph of the universe? Like it's just a photograph of space and there's the universe and then there's the arrow that points to this little teeny tiny speck and it says you are here.
Right.
I love
Exactly.
that. I had it hanging on my refrigerator for the longest time because I think it's just such a good reminder when we start taking life too seriously to just remember like you are right here in this little blip in the universe.
Yeah.
So where can listeners find a copy?
Um, at the moment, the best place is just going to my website,
Yep.
matthewkiell.com, as long as you spell it correctly.
Okay, two
Um,
L's.
two L's, two T's.
I'll put it
Um,
in the notes
yeah.
too. Yeah.
Um, and I've had some problems as far as Amazon was concerned, technical things. So I'm trying to get it back up by the time this appears. Probably
Okay.
Amazon will be an option, Barnes will be an option, but you can get it directly from me and
I'm always
skip all the
an advocate to just
intermediaries.
support the author anyway. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
What are you doing next?
Well, I always have a few ideas burning in my head for years and years. I have, I do have an idea for sort of another memoir where it's based on objects. Just the, I was just recently just walking around my house looking at some of the most mundane sort of things in my house. Um, what really prompted it was I have it's really a partial set of silverware that's from what my parents bought when we were in Denmark when I was 6 years old. And, every time you pick it up, in ways it's very faded. It has these a whole line of ridges, and in the interior of each ridge, it used to be sort of a black enamel, and that is almost totally gone now in all of after 60 years of dishwashing.
Sure.
But almost every time I pick one of those up, there's a fleeting thought about, you know, seeing the row house we lived in Denmark when I was 6 years old.
Yeah.
Just the style of Denmark that's still, timeless Scandinavian design
Hmm.
that these forks and knives and spoons. Um, and there are a number of, I was just thinking there are a dozen or so particular objects that at first would make little sense to have much significance, but they each have a story, with the idea that, the lesson behind it is, you know, using them as a sort of anchor to tell stories about your life.
What a creative idea. Brilliant.
I also have a novel that has been floating in my head that I thought I might be able to write during NaNoWriMo last year, but I didn't get going on that for 3 or 4 years. It's based, the titles of each chapter are almost totally unknown lyrics to one of the most famous songs ever written.
All of the chapters are from this one song. All the chapter
All the
titles are
chapter
from this one
titles
song.
will be from the lyrics. Yeah. But the lyrics are ones that very few people know.
Really? I'm intrigued. Will you tell me which song?
After we get off.
Okay, okay. Fair enough.
Okay.
Fair enough. And you also have a Substack, right?
I do. I've started up a Substack, and part of the idea of it's called The Writer's Mind. The idea is exploring some of the things that come up in a memory mosaic. However, some of them are extracts from the book, from the creating your memoir
Mhm.
sections, but a lot of them are also just tips and ideas that I've had along the way. Um, one of the early ones is the idea of anybody's memoir actually being a 1,000,000 word book. That for me, I only wrote 70,000 words approximately in this 200-page book.
Yeah.
But whenever I pick it up and read a small portion of it, it's prompting
Something
hundreds of
else.
thousands of words worth of memories
Yep.
and additional stories. A few of them will be work their way in to the Substack. One or two, especially, there's one post that I did about the structure and the fact of
Mhm.
showing how the structure works as opposed to covering it over, and the inspiration that I used for that idea. It's a famous building in Paris. Um, but also just that this book that's 70,000 words, if you read it and because of the nature of what I'm writing about and what I'm suggesting to you, you're probably creating in your own head a 1,000,000 word book
Most
that
definitely.
has, which, you know, 930,000 of those words are make no sense to me.
Yep.
They're your story that's been prompted by this.
Yep.
And I guess that's sort of what I say in that post is the idea, you know, even if a small number of people get inspired in reading this book just to think about their lives, and
Mhm.
especially if somebody then writes their own book and gets completed with it and passes it on to other people,
Yeah.
that this one small book is just the tip of the iceberg, a very large iceberg just grows and grows in that way. And that's,
It's very
I
true.
mean, there are books, movies as well that you can tell a story and it's really interesting, and then you're done with it, you put it down, you turn it off, you go to the refrigerator, and by 10 minutes later it's background and you barely think about it again. And there are books and movies that keep you thinking for days or weeks or years after.
That sometimes you read 2, 3
Right,
times.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think too, even if you don't go back and read them, or if you're not even consciously thinking of them, there are a lot of books that stick in your subconscious and they plant little
Yeah.
seeds that
Mhm.
you carry forward as well.
Yeah.
Right? Same way with movies and everything else, I suppose.
Mhm.
I just like books.
All right.
Well,
All right,
Matthew,
Kelly.
this has been a pleasure. Thank you so
A
much
pleasure
for
for me
agreeing to
too.
come on and talk to me. I'm hoping we can chat a little bit more when I roll out this craft series in season 2.
Absolutely.
I would love to come on and talk about, excuse me, some of the subjects that you talk about in your Substack.
Okay.
All
Absolutely.
right. All righty. We'll be in touch.
For Love of Memoir is a place for people who have a passion for human stories. The ones we tell, the ones we carry, and the ones we're still trying to understand. Here, we talk with writers about their life-changing experiences and what it takes to bring those stories onto the page and into the world. Whether you simply love a good story or aspire to write your own, you're in the right place.